ताम्रारविन्देक्षणम् भक्ताभीष्टवरभयप्रदकरम् कौपीनमात्रोज्ज्वलम् स्वात्मानन्दरसानुभूतिविवशम् सर्वानवद्यांगकम् श्रीमन्तं श्रीरमणेश्वरं गुरुवरं योगासनाध्यासितं ध्यायेत् श्रीरमणेश्वरम् ध्यायेत् श्रीरमणेश्वरम् ध्यायेत् श्रीरमणेश्वरम् हृदयकुहरमध्ये केवलं ब्रह्ममात्रम् यहमहमिति साक्षातात्मरूपेण भाति हृदि विषमनसा स्वं चिन्वतामच्युतव पवनचलनरोधात् आत्मनिष्ठो भवत्वम्। Namo Ramana. We will commence the Friday evening Atma Vichara by listening to Bhagavan's Upadesham. As always, this week too, we will be reading from the book Ramana Answers, Self-Enquiry 1900 to 1950, a compilation of all the answers, questions asked by devotees on Atma Vichara and answers given by Bhagavan on Atma Vichara. So, this compilation has been done by our founder, President Sri A.R. Natarajanji. And we are now looking at the question answer sessions between 1936 to 1950. After contemplating on this week's question and answer, we will have a 20 minutes Atma Vichara session, following which our President, our Sharda Akka, would be meditating on the teachings as it has been outlined in Ramana Gita by Ganapati Muni, which is also a question answer between devotees and Bhagavan, which has been captured by Ganapati Muni. This week question is the 36th question. The devotee is asking, how is one to know the self? The question is, how is one to know the self? Bhagavan says, knowing the self means being the self. Can you say that you do not know the self? Though you cannot see your own eyes, and though not provided with a mirror to look in, do you deny the existence of your own eyes? Similarly, you are aware of the self, even though the self is not objectified. When you say, I cannot know the self, it means absence in terms of relative knowledge. Because you have been so accustomed to relative knowledge that you identify yourself with it. Such wrong identity has forged the difficulty of not knowing the obvious self because it cannot be objectified, and you ask, how is one to know the self? Your difficulty is centered in how. Who is to know the self? Your duty is to be and not to be this or that. I am that I am sums up the whole truth. The method is summed up in be still. What does stillness mean? It means destroy yourself, because any form or shape is the cause of trouble. Give up the notion that I am so and so. Our scriptures declare that it shines as I. A beautiful answer and a beautiful question. We will look at line by line. The question is, how is one to know the self? Bhagavan says, knowing the self means being the self. By this clarity, Bhagavan is very simply putting it. Anything we say, if we say we know, then the knower is there. And therefore, especially when it comes to knowing the self, nobody can claim, because then the knower is there. And therefore, that knower has seen something as object. That's when he can claim as I know the self. The self has then become an object, and the knower has become the subject. And therefore, if one claims I know the self, that is a wrong claim. That's what we can look at it as. So Bhagavan therefore says, knowing the self means only being the self. So nobody can say I know the self. One can remain in one's natural state, and that is the being the self, and that itself is truly knowing, because you have now understood how the self is, that it cannot be objectified. Therefore, if all objective approach is removed and one is remaining as one is, that is the true knowing of the self. That is actually being the self and knowing the self are one and the same. Further, Bhagavan goes on to say, can you say that you do not know the self? Again, this is another one. Because our approach is to know the self as an object. Bhagavan is asking, when everything is comprehended by the self, there is no other entity which is self-luminous and something which can know other than the self. Self alone can know. Self is pure awareness. So, when we say I don't know the self, how absurd it is, says Bhagavan, because we know that we don't know. Even when we say I don't know, we know, and therefore knowing is always the truth that is there as a substrat, and that is the self. So when somebody says, can you say that you do not know the self, though you cannot see your own eyes, and though not provided with a mirror to look in, do you deny the existence of your eyes? This is a very classical example that is brought about for all of us to contemplate in the traditional path. Suppose the eyes wants to see itself. It is the subject, and can it also become the object? Suppose there is no mirror for it to see, then can it become both the subject and object? Impossible. But just because it cannot become both the subject and the object the subject to see and the object to be seen as, can we deny there is no eyes? No. The very instrument through which we perceive every other object is by the eye only. So the eye, the presence of the eye is very well known. So then being the eye, in the context of that, knowing the eye is being the eye. Like it is similar to that. Knowing the self is being the self. So because the eye is the substratum, eye is naturally there in all the visual, all the things that we see, or it is through which we see everything else. Therefore, the eyes is, we cannot deny the absence of the eye at all. In a similar way, everything we are aware, whether it is everything in the waking, if we are aware, everything in the sleep where we say there is no objects, there also we are aware of the absence of object. Or if we have a dream and see many things, there also we are aware. See, awareness, therefore, is our natural state. We cannot make awareness as an object. It is through awareness that we are aware of everything. That is what Bhagavan is trying to say here. Therefore, the whole approach to objectify the self is the very problem we need to understand. And that is what Bhagavan goes on to explain. Similarly, you are aware of the self, even though the self is not objectified, because self is awareness, and we are always aware. We are always aware. Even when I say I don't know the self, I know. Therefore, we are always aware, always aware. The the whole problem is trying to objectify. And Bhagavan says, when you say I cannot know the self, it means absence in terms of relative knowledge. That means when I am trying to know the self as an object, or I am holding on to a thought called I cannot know the self. So it is known by the self on itself. The thought, the very thought that I cannot know the self, is also known by the self. But the self itself cannot be known through any relative knowledge, like a thought. Like the thought is known because it is relative to the knower, relative to the awareness. Whereas the self, being both the subject and the object, can never become relative to it. This is what Bhagavan is trying to convey here. Such wrong identity has forged the difficulty of not knowing the obvious self because it cannot be objectified. This is the ultimate thing. So, all our effort when we sit in sadhana, every time we ask the question, who am I? We should become aware. We should see, are we trying to know the self as an object? If that is the case, then the approach is not correct. Therefore, when all objects are dropped, what remains is only the self alone. Or even when the object is seen, it is seen only by the self alone. So, self is always present. My natural state of being aware, being and consciousness cannot be removed. That clarity has to come, and one has to identify oneself with that being awareness. One should stop identifying oneself with all the non-self, all the thoughts. So if a thought comes, I do not know the self, instead of identifying oneself with the thought that I do not know the self, we should inquire, to whom is this? Me. So that is I, the awareness. Who am I? So when I question who am I and realize, oh, I am the self. So just by attending to this thought, I could have got into an ocean of bewilderment that I don't know the self, and therefore I could have become sad. Then, therefore, I could have gone into many other thoughts also built on top of it. However, here I am, always the awareness, always the being consciousness. Never it is me, the screen on which all the thoughts come, stay for a while, go away. I am aware when the thought rises. I am aware when the thoughts stay. I am aware when the thoughts are dissolved. But I never go out of the picture. It is I, the screen, the self. This recognition is what Bhagavan asks us to do, and then further be that I. This knowing is also an object. It can become a thought now. Oh, I know the self, can become again a new identity, a new ego, or a new higher level thing. We can call it as we can call it as a golden prison, because now I am identified with a new knowledge that I have understood the self. But that again is a identification with a thought, not with the awareness. And therefore, Swami Vivekananda says, now when you are ignorant, you can say that you are in a steel prison or an iron prison. But once you say, I know the self, because of the intellectual understanding, and I start identifying yourself with that, now you are in a golden prison. Therefore, really knowing the self is being that pure awareness, being that pure consciousness alone, free of all objects. That has to become very clear, and that is what we are. So why do I perceive this object? What do I get out of it? Absolutely nothing else but bewilderment. Therefore, Bhagavan says, whenever a thought rises, don't pursue it. Inquire to whom is this? Who am I? And get back to the self. And by repeated practice, Bhagavan says that we will have enough strength to simply remain free of all objects, all thoughts. In fact, we understand that our real nature is niralambha. It is not dependent on objects. Whereas this I entity, the first foremost division which has happened in the self, which identifies itself with the body on one side and awareness on the other side, the spurious I entity or the ego entity, it cannot remain without objects. Whereas the pure self that we are, it can remain without I. And we see that in the deep sleep. There is no I thought, and yet we are there to be aware of it. So Bhagavan is saying that that clarity is very, very important. So he says, how is one to know the self? Your difficulty is centered in how. As we discussed, in our meditation, we should not try to more go on how to know the self, how to hold on to the self. We should not go approach it in on the how part. We should rather ask, who is to know the self? Who is this wants to understand? Because he is the spurious identity or the individual notion which has one side identified with the awareness, as though he can know, he can do, he has, and on the other side with the body and the mind or the intellect, and therefore he can do. On one side he is identified with the consciousness, therefore he believes he can know. On the other side he is identified with the body, mind, and the intellect, and therefore he thinks that he can do. And because our identification is with that spurious entity, our whole effort, Bhagavan says here, is centered around this how. But if we were to simply question, who is to know, who is to do, and then the answer will come as I. It is for me. I want to know, I want to do. And then the I, which is the the first and the foremost division that has appeared, becomes available for vichara. And when we inquire, who am I? What do I really refer to as I? And dive within, we see that we are nothing but the self, and self alone is. And this spurious entity was all the reason why we were getting bewildered. The immense grace of Bhagavan, with which alone we have come to this most direct path. With His grace, let us do Atma Vichara for the next 20 minutes. In this Atma Vichara, no matter how many thought comes, no matter whatever is the nature of the thought, good, bad, or ugly, we have to recognize that it is an object. to that spurious entity called I, who is on one side attached with the awareness, the other side attached with the body, who is trying to do this inquiry, this sadhana. So when we inquire to whom is this thought, we see that to that spurious entity, I is it is for that I. Further, Bhagavan asks us to inquire, who am I? And trace the I back to its source. Or what do I really refer to as I within me? When we trace it back to the source, we see that the I is absorbed in that pure being consciousness that we are. And with repeated practice, Bhagavan assures that the mind will gain enough strength to remain at the source. The immense grace of Bhagavan, for the next 20 minutes, let us do Atma Vichara. Namo Bhagavate Shri Ramanaya. Namo Ramana. Over to Sharda.
Namo Ramana. Prostrations to Ramana, shining as a self in all beings. With the immense grace of the self manifest as Ramana, we are meditating on the teachings and the practice of self-enquiry and have been able to actually sit in practice by that grace. We have been meditating in this part of the satsang on Bhagavan's answers to Ganapati Muni and other devotees, which have been put together by Muni as Ramana Gita. And we are on the chapter Signs of the Heart. And in this chapter, Bhagavan has talked to us about how the heart is the source of everything, the source of, then he also has pointed out it is the source of all thoughts, and he has taught us about Nirvikalpa Samadhi and Sahaja Samadhi, and he said then finally in the last set of two verses which we covered, Bhagavan said that the whole world exists only in the mind. Without any reminder, without any trace of the slightest part left out, the entire world is contained in the mind, and the mind is contained fully in the spiritual heart. Therefore, the world of the universe, everything is contained in the heart. Ashesha hridaye tasmat katha parisamapyate. The story finishes there, says Bhagavan. Katha parisamapyate. This entire story of life which we are building, a story which we are carrying on with, a story which we are so engaged in, that story finds its culmination in the heart, says Bhagavan. And he continues, Kirtyate hridayam pinde yathande bhanumandalam manasahasraragatam bimbam chandramasam tatha manasahasraragatam bimbam chandramasam yatha. He says that Kirtyate hridayam pinde yathande bhanumandalam. The pinda or the body is lighted by the heart. The way the anda or the universe or the world is lighted by the sun. Yatha ande bhanumandalam. The sun, the way the sun lights the world, the heart lights the entire functions of the body. The entire body is lighted by the heart. And what is the place of the Sahasrara or the mind? Because Bhagavan said that mind, the seat of the mind is Sahasrara. What is the role of the Sahasrara? Bhagavan says it is Manas Sahasraragatam. If the mind is in Sahasrara, it is Bimbam Chandramasam Yatha. It is like the rays of the moon. So, if the mind is stationed in the Sahasrara, then it's like functioning with the moonlight, says Bhagavan. Whereas if one is, the real light for the whole body comes from the heart. It is like sunlight. And what is the nature of sunlight? The nature of sunlight is that it is never absent. It is never absent. Whereas the nature of moonlight is that it is always changing. It is ever changing. It waxes and it wanes. It grows and it decays. This is the experience of all. This is the nature of all mind-based experiences. Whereas if one abides in the heart, then there is the fullness of the light. The light never goes away. It is. And it's not changing, and it's not dependent on any of our experiences. This is what Bhagavan is trying to say when he is giving us the example of the sun. The example of the sun, of course, we all know that the sun is life-giving for the earth. Even so, the heart is life-giving for this body, says Bhagavan. And it is life-giving and light-giving. So, it is the Sat and it is the Chit. And because of this, it is also Ananda. Because of that, it's also joy. But if one is stationed in the mind, Manas Sahasraragatam, Bimbam Chandramasam Yatha. Then he goes on to say, Yatha Dhadati Tapanah Tejah Kairavabandhave Idam Vitarati Jyoti Hridayam Manase Tatha. So just as the heart, just as the sun lights the moon, the heart lights the mind. So the source of the mind is the heart. Bhagavan already told us that in the previous verse. He said the world is stationed in the mind and the mind is to be stationed in the heart. The mind springs from the heart. The mind derives its energy from the heart. So it is the heart alone. Here Bhagavan is explaining that through means of the example of the sun and the moon. So functioning by the moonlight, which we do, and which is actually lighted by the sun. If we fail to realize that it is the sun which gives light to the moon, then what is our position? Our position is that we are dependent on a transient, changing entity. As Dileep was saying, it is not a true entity. It is an imposter. Why is it an imposter? Because it doesn't have any light of its own. The moon doesn't have any light of its own. The light of the moon is only borrowed light. It is borrowed from the sun. If we imagine that the moon is supreme, we are forgetting the fact that it has no light of its own. Similarly, when we forget that the source of the mind is the heart, Bhagavan says that we get caught in that realm of the mind. Hridya sannihito martyo manah kevalamikshate. See, the fact that there is the mind lighted by the heart and the mind is functioning, the pure mind is functioning, is not a cause, is not cause for worry, is not the root of any problem. But the problem arises, hridya sannihito. We become separated. We are not present in the heart. Asannihito hridayaha. Without being present in the heart, manak kevalam ikshate. We see the mind alone. We see the mind alone. So Bhagavan says the problem is when you say martyo, the mortals, the one who are bound to that which is mortal, to that which is transient, are seeing only the light of the mind. What is this like? Asannikarshe suryasya ratrau chandre yata mahaha. So it's like the moon is very, very predominant It seems to be huge when in the night time, because we are not linked to the sunlight. When one is not linked to the sunlight, and then one is in the darkness, it becomes night. One is caught in the darkness of ignorance, and in that ignorance the mind plays a very, very important part, says Bhagavan. We are so caught up in this mind. It is so important for us. What is Bhagavan asking us to do in self-inquiry? He says, inquire when thought arises. When thought arises, ask for whom is this thought, and let the thought drop. Let it sink into the heart. Why? Because it has no light of its own. It is as jada, as lightless as the moon is lightless. It is a mere reflection of the light of the heart. But we give it so much of importance. Otherwise, why do we have to be asked to question the thought and get back to the source? It's only because thought plays such an important role for us. We, we believe that it is a source of light for us. We believe that it is very, very important to be able to think. Unless we believe it is important to be able to think, why would we have any thought at all? Thoughts must drop off. If there is no significance in thinking, Bhagavan says to us, thinking is not your nature, he says. So if thinking is not our nature, why do we have to think at all? What is the purpose of thinking? The purpose of thinking, we believe, is that it takes us somewhere. It gives us some meaning. It adds some meaning to life. In fact, everything is dependent on thinking, we feel. And that's why Bhagavan says over here, it is like a person who is in the depth of the night and feels that the moon is supreme. Ratrau Chandre Yatamaha. So Bhagavan is giving us over here a very, very significant clue that we don't lose anything by giving up our thoughts. It is only like trading moonlight for sunlight. It is nothing less than that, nothing more than that. If we are afraid, because there is the fear. You see, Paul Brenton also asked Bhagavan, will one become an idiot if one stops thinking? If one pursues self-inquiry and stops thinking, will he become an idiot? He asked. Bhagavan says, no, that is when you really come alive. That is your true self. Far from being an idiot. Right now, you are caught in a situation where the limited light of the moon, not only is it limited, see, at best, it is limited. How much can we see through moonlight, even on a full moon day? How much gets lit and for how long? Maximum moonlight is on a full moon day. But the full moon does not remain full. For more than one night, it does not remain full. It will wane. It will go down, go down, go down, go down, and it will become a new moon or a no moon. So that is the way of the mind. If we are depending on the light of the mind, we cannot say when it will let us down, when it will wane, when it will become Amavasya or new moon. How can we say? In the moonlight there is a particular pattern. There is a pattern that it wanes for 7 days and again it waxes for 7 days. So we can be more or less certain that, okay, this day is going to be a dark day and this day is going to be a bright day. But The mind doesn't give us even that much of guarantee. We do not know, in one moment it becomes dull, one moment it is bright. We can never predict like the cycles of the moon. We only know that similar to the cycles of the moon, the light of the mind also wanes and waxes. It's very clear to us. We're able to see sometimes the mind is so crystal clear, it is bright, it is aware, it knows what is shown to it, it comprehends things easily, it is sensitive to the atmosphere, everything. There is so much of light in the mind on some days. And on other days, it's full of so much of darkness that it's very painful. It's almost painful. The darkness in our own mind is really very disturbing. We wonder, why is it so dark? Why is it so despondent? There seems to be so much of despair and agony and fear somewhere lurking in the background. See, when it is dark, there is a lot of fear. We do not know what lies where, what could attack us, what could spring up from where. We don't know when it's dark. So, light means a lot of joy because it brings us so much of clarity, and it brings knowledge, and it brings certainty. Even if there is something we are afraid of in front of us, we can see it. But imagine if it is dark, we do not even know whether there is something in front of us. We don't know anything. So, living by the light of the mind, Bhagavan is compassionately telling us, is something painful. Okay, so he says, Bhavan Bhramyati Pamaraha Apashyam Stejaso Moolam Swarupam Satyamatmanaha Manasacha Prithak Pashyan Bhavan Bhramyati Pamaraha. This Bhramyati is also, is there a phrase or a epithet used in the Bhagavad Gita? He says, Yantrarudani Mayaya Brahmayan Sarvajaivani. I am making them just wander around. Brahmyati, just wandering around in the dark. Manasacha Prithak Pashyan. Apashyam Stejaso Moolam. Not seeing the light, the source of light. What happens? Swarupam, which is the Swarupam, which is our own true nature, which is the Satyamatmanaha, which is the true self. Manasacha Prithak Pashyan. Seeing everything is divided through the mind, we get caught in bhava, we get caught in thoughts, we get caught in concepts, and we begin to wander. We are left wandering hither and thither. And Muruganar Swami says, how is our wandering? He says it's like a street dog, which again and again goes to the rubbish heap, again and again and again. Muruganar Swami uses the word 3 times. He says, Ternade, Ternade, Terndu. Terkadai alayindu thiriyum naai pola. Ternade, Ternade, Terndu. Again and again it is sniffing at the same rubbish. And that is how we are wandering. We are again and again sniffing at objects which are encased in experiences which we call thoughts. Again and again we are wandering behind thoughts. We trust in thoughts. We trust in the limited, transient light, the moonlight of thoughts, the moonlight of the mind, forgetting, Bhagavan says, the source, which is ever shining bright, which is ever available, which never goes away, whether or not we are recognizing its presence, whether or not we see it, Whether or not we turn to it, whether or not we adore it and we long for it and love it, it is available. It is ever available. When he gives us the example of sunlight, Bhagavan is assuring us that the light of the self is ever available. It never goes away. It never can go away. Just like sunlight cannot go away anywhere. The light of the self cannot leave us, cannot desert us. And that is the great assurance Bhagavan is giving us by His grace. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri.
Tomorrow.